One of the most compelling sources of contemporary horror is the phenomena of serial killers. From true crime to horror fiction, as a nation, we obsess over these terrifying, fascinating figures, which is just sick. But it's not just murder stories that we freak out about, it's real-life killings. We want to know the details and why people are nuts. We're fascinated with why so many serial murderers are hard to catch, and how they can just walk around among us for so long, unnoticed. It's actually quite chilling. Of course, there's serial killers all over the world, but for some reason, historically, most have been here in the United States. Why is that? Going back 100 years or so, there's been more than 2,600 serial murders in this country. There's all sorts of serial murderers. Examples are the sniper attacks which happen in the Washington, D.C. metro area, to the Zodiac Killer, and sickos like Charles Manson. But according to the FBI, serial killings are relatively uncommon occurrences, accounting for less than 1% of all murders in a given year. In order to determine where the serial murder capitals of the United States are, we had to look through the FBI database. I looked at which states have the most serial murders going all the way back to 1900, and then I measured it on a per capita basis. The FBI defines a serial killer as somebody who commits 2 or more murders as separate events, and it's usually done by one person acting alone. Well, enough of that intro stuff, let's get right to it. So let's pull the blinds, turn out the lights, and get our morbid fascination on. We're going to talk about the serial killer capitals of the country, and kind of the world. We're going to begin our tour of the serial murder capitals in the U.S. here in Oklahoma. If you live there, you're a little bit more freaked out right now. Since the turn of the 20th century, there have been 174 serial murders in Oklahoma. And when you compare that with the state's population, serial killings are occurring more frequently in Oklahoma than all but 9 other states. And the 1980s were the worst decade for Oklahoma serial murders. And that decade alone, there were 48 documented serial killings in Oklahoma. And Oklahoma's serial murder count doesn't even count what happened in Oklahoma City in 1995 when this lunatic set up bombs in a building, and that killed 168 people. It was one of the worst homegrown terrorist attacks in the country. But it doesn't count as a serial killing because serial murders are separate consecutive murders, while mass murders are mini killings in one incident. This lunatic is the most famous serial killer in Oklahoma's history. He began in 1978. He and his wife and brother pulled over along I-35 near Purcell, Oklahoma. They flagged down a family of 3, and when they pulled over, they robbed them and shot them all. Then 3 weeks later, this guy murdered 6 employees at a restaurant in Oklahoma City during another robbery. His wife eventually confessed that this dude killed 34 people in 6 different states. He died of lethal injection in 1995 after 16 years in the Oklahoma State Pen. Good. Hopefully all that's behind us now, but if you live in Oklahoma, you might be a little more unnerved. Our next serial murder capital in the USA is in Utah. Utah? What? Isn't that a bunch of God-fearing Mormons? What's going on there? Again, the 80s were the worst decade for serial murders here. What was going on in the 80s? My God. Arthur Gary Bishop, also known as Roger Downs, he was a serial killer operating at that time between 1979 and 1983. He was accused of killing 5 kids by beating them or drowning them to death, and was eventually executed by lethal injection in 1988. But the most famous serial murderer here was Ted Bundy. He lived in Utah from 1974 until he was caught in 1975. He killed at least 36 women in multiple states, although some estimate he could have killed close to 100 people. Ted Bundy killed at least 5 and maybe 8 young teenage women in the greater Salt Lake City area around 1974, but he blended into society, which allowed him to keep committing his crimes. He attended the University of Utah Law School, and he also became a baptized Mormon. He actually finally got caught here in Utah when a female victim escaped. He tried to kidnap a teenager outside of a mall, and she fought with all her might and thrashed him and fought and broke all her fingernails. She remembers Bundy's beady, blank, lifeless eyes. She says she was very lucky that she managed to jump out of his car and escape. It was really shocking to find out later that he was so angry she got away, he just drove somewhere else and killed somebody else. Apparently the LDS Church had his back and even showed up to his trial to support him. They just knew he was innocent of all charges, they said. He was finally electrocuted in 1989. Good. Pretty scary stuff though, Utah. And on that tragic note, we're going to get the hell out of Utah, I'll tell you that. But we're in Texas now, where things are even worse, at least statistically. Here in Texas, there have been nearly 800 serial killings since the year 1900. Many of them have been executed by this state, which doesn't mess around. Rafael Resendez Ramirez, also known as the Railroad Killer, murdered at least 15 people in Kentucky, Texas, and Illinois before he surrendered in 1999. According to the FBI, traveling to other states is actually pretty unusual among serial killers when they carry out their crimes. The one who did the most damage here in Texas was a real sicko, a man named Carl Eugene Watts. This guy told the cops he killed almost 100 women in Michigan and in Texas, but only 12 bodies were found in the state. He was the son of an army officer, and he always killed women between the ages of 14 and 44. They called him the Sunday morning slasher because he would sneak into women's homes on Sundays and then strangle, stab, or drown his victims. He was hard to catch because he never left any DNA, but they finally got him 8 years after he started his spree. He was attempting to kill 2 women in their Houston home. He strangled one of them, and she pretended to be unconscious, and she waited for him to go upstairs to fill the bathtub to drown her, and then she ran out of the house and called the cops. He served 20 years in Texas prisons, and then he spent time in Michigan's prisons, and then he finally died of cancer while locked up at the age of 53, and hopefully he went to hell. The 2000s were a terrible decade for Louisianans. Most of the victims in the state were either shot or strangled. And weirdly, many victims here met their killers at a bar. Between 1990 and 2010, 25 Louisiana residents were murdered by a serial killer that they had met at a bar. This freak is Ronald Joseph Dominique, otherwise known as the Bayou Strangler. He killed the most people in the state, at least 23 men and boys, between 1997 and 2006. He grew up in a trailer park in Thibodaux and was picked on a lot as a kid. His victims were usually young men he met in bars who were homeless or druggies. He would usually befriend them and lure them to his trailer with promises of sex, and then he'd kill them, and he'd dump their bodies in the swamps. Look at this list of all the people he killed. The FBI called his conviction the most significant serial killer case in the country for that period. Now, serial killers have some common characteristics among them. Many are psychopaths. Many were abused by a family member, and many have a fascination with setting fires. However, despite the stereotypes we see in movies, serial murderers don't have a great deal in common with one another. Their preferred victims, their motives for killing, their patterns, and their locations all vary greatly. Fewer than half of serial killers since 1900 have been both male and white. Intelligence also varies greatly among serial killers. Their IQs range from 54 to as high as 186, though the average IQ is 86, which is slightly below average. And only 15% of serial murderers are women. Well, here we are in Oregon, which is also a creepy place in a lot of areas. The 80s were also a frightening time to live in this state too. Now, compared to other states, Oregon has a relatively low rate of violent crime per capita. However, serial killings happen with more frequency per capita in this state than almost anywhere else in the nation. Most serial killers use a gun on their victims. However, in Oregon, serial killers have strangled their victims to death more than any other killing method. And by the way, you can see all of Oregon's victims here on a website you may not even know about, Murderpedia, which is just sad that we have a website called Murderpedia. The list is somewhat accurate, like this guy claims to have killed between 3 and 18 people or more. Sometimes serial killers claim to have killed more people than they actually did for the attention. But this guy, Dayton Leroy Rogers, killed at least 7 people in the state, usually by torture. All were women he met on the street, hookers, druggies, runaways, homeless. He often took them to remote areas, often in the forest, where he would tie them up and kill them. They called him the Molalla Forest Murderer because his victims were all found in wooded areas outside of Molalla, about 30 miles south of Portland. He keeps getting the death penalty, but nobody's killed him yet. He just rots in a prison in Oregon to this day. That's creepy, dude. Why are you just staring at me like that? What? Okay, this is weird. You know what? Based on what's happened so far in this video, I think I better call the cops and report this. What do you want? Hey, super gay cop. Mappy's acting weird and he's staring at me funny. Think something's up? Mappy's a serial killer, duh. What? Mappy's a serial killer? No way! Back to our very bone-chilling tour as we go right next door to our next serial killer capital, Washington, which is also a creepy place. Again, the 80s in the Pacific Northwest must have been really scary out in places like this. Now you might think that serial killers look like crazy sociopaths, but in fact, a lot of the crimes were committed by people that lead seemingly normal lives. Here's an example. Gary Ridgway, who was known as the Green River Killer, he worked as a truck painter, he attended church, and even read the Bible all the time. He eventually confessed to committing 49 murders over a 20-year period in the Seattle area. Most of the time, he strangled women. He confessed to 49, but they think he killed at least 70. That would make him the second most prolific serial killer in modern U.S. history. Most of this guy's victims were sex workers or women living on the streets. His first 5 victims were found in the Green River, just outside of Seattle. They eventually caught him because his DNA matched the DNA at the scene of several of the bodies. He confessed, so he was saved from the death penalty. How do we let these people continue to live among us? What the hell? Kill them. Per capita, the state of California has the 4th most serial killers of all time. It was so bad here in the 80s that 1 out of 5 serial murders in the country took place here in California. Half the victims were either shot or were strangled. In the 60s, the state had the Zodiac Killer. He confessed to 37 murders in Northern California, but nobody knows how many victims there were, and he has never been caught. The Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez, terrorized everybody in LA and San Francisco in the 80s and wound up killing 15 people. He just broke into people's homes and robbed them and killed them. Just a terrible person. This creep was actually captured by bystanders who recognized him because it was all over the news. They beat him up and held him down until the cops arrived, but that was after 2 years of terror. He later died in prison from lymphoma while awaiting execution, and hopefully he is in hell. With the Night Stalker, home invasion was his preferred pattern, but each serial killer has their own pattern and motive. Florida trails just 2 other states in terms of total serial killer victims per capita, with 778 documented victims since 1990. As was the case across the nation, serial killers were most active during the 80s here too. The most prolific serial killer of all time began his spree here in Florida, and you might not even recognize his name. It's Samuel Little. He was charged with killing like 50 people, but says he killed close to 100. Nobody really knows. It all began back in Miami in 1971. And he went on to kill 11 more people in the state before he was caught in the middle of another murder in a parking lot. In total, his murder spree lasted for nearly 4 decades. Most of his victims were women who were prostitutes or who were homeless. This guy had been arrested a bunch for various crimes and just let out of prison, so most of these murders could have been avoided had they let him rot in jail. And because he confessed to all his murders, he avoided the death penalty. That sucks. Nevada might be a bit of a surprise, or maybe not. I mean, this is home to a history of the mob and illegal activities and vagrants and all sorts of bad stuff. And Nevada has the nation's 9th highest violent rate, too. Now, over the first half of the 20th century, only 2 people were killed by serial killers in Nevada, but then there were 33 victims in the 80s alone. As you might expect, the spike of serial killings coincided with Las Vegas's gambling boom. Prostitutes have always been a big target for serial killers in Nevada. This guy is Carroll Edward Cole. He killed at least 15 women in Nevada, beginning all the way back in 1947 and up until 1980. He says he did most of it to get back at his mother. He had been in and out of prison and in and out of mental hospitals for years, and nobody thought to lock him up for good. One time in 1979, he just walked up to a woman in a Las Vegas bar, bought her a drink, took her to his hotel room, and strangled her. He didn't even know her name. He was finally lethally injected in 1985. Good. And which state has the most serial killers per capita? It's probably not a surprise that it's Alaska, the land of isolation and darkness. It's also the most violent state in the nation, too. More than half of this state's serial murders took place in the 80s. Is that why we were all so into Nightmare on Elm Street and Jason and all those scary movies in the 80s? Robert Hansen, perhaps the most prolific serial killer in this state's history, was sentenced to 461 years of prison in 1984 after confessing to the gruesome murders of 17 women. There's a lot of theories to account for why Alaska produces and houses so many serial killers. Of course, it's dark here for a lot of the year, which can make people go crazy. And the cover of darkness also provides the perfect opportunity to target a victim. The size and isolation of the Alaskan wilderness is probably an appealing factor. The seclusion out here provides a lot of opportunity to prey on vulnerable people, and a lot of places to hide evidence. The nature of the workforce is another factor. I mean, there's a lot of logging and construction and oil jobs, and those employ a lot of seasonal workers. Plus, the lack of law enforcement in isolated regions of this state can make it easier to get away with crimes. There's a lot of serial killers who get away with stuff because there's just compromised police work. They don't have enough cops, and it's just too much land to cover. Alaska's dangerous in many, many ways, and it's probably going to remain so for a long time. Okay, so that's it. Our look at the serial murder capitals of the country. If you were alive in the 80s, you remember how scary things were back then. But take solace, fellow Americans. It seems that the trend of the American serial killer might be a dying breed. Since the peak in the 80s, there's either less serial killers now or cops have gotten better at catching them earlier. But sadly, while the serial killer age is behind us, today's problem is much, much bigger. It's hard to pinpoint exactly why we find serial killers so fascinating, but there's a strange allure in exploring the dark pathologies of the human mind. It's similar to the reason why we enjoy tales of true crime. Learning about murders and crime is just part of our human nature, and that is just so sad. Hey guys, if you learned something new about America or what it's like to live in America, great! You should think about subscribing and turning on your notifications. You can also click one of these videos or playlists for more. You can also now buy my songs on iTunes and other formats. Click the link in the description. Thanks for watching. And remember, while we all might have different views, we should all be nice to each other and try to make the U.S. a better place in a positive way.
This is Sage, Nick's manager. This has been a Corner House Entertainment production.